This ACCC inquiry has been launched into the big four banks and why it is, or isn't, usually isn't, passing on those interest rate cuts in full. Joining me now is Labor frontbencher Dr Andrew Leigh. Andrew Leigh, thanks for your time. Do you support this ACCC inquiry?
It certainly seems like Josh Frydenberg's finally yielded to community pressure to do something about the big banks not passing on rate cuts. We know this has a big impact on household budgets and it's important to ensure that those rate cuts are passed on in full. Our banks are very profitable and that's why Labor was calling last month for an ACCC inquiry into competition in the banking sector. At the time, Liberals were saying we didn't need it, that the banks were already dealing with too much in the context of the Royal Commission. So I'm pleased that Josh Frydenberg seems to have finally yielded to community pressure. But let's not think of him as somebody who is always on the side of the customer. He, of course, is somebody who voted 26 times against a banking Royal Commission and voted against Labor's abolition of mortgage exit fees, a pro-competitive measure when we were last in government.
Wayne Swan used similar language back in 2010, so the banks have been ignoring governments of all colours for more than a decade, probably even longer. So why would it be any different under a coalition?
You've got to ask why the government isn't willing to bring all guns blazing on this issue, why last month they were pushing back against the ACCC's desire to look more carefully at competition in the banking sector. We do need to make sure that Australians are getting the best deal. I worry particularly about these findings, Laura.
Look like in your view?
I think we need to ensure that the ACCC is doing the inquiries it wants to do. They should have been getting on with the job last month when they asked the government to engage in a competition inquiry with big banks. But it also means that you need appropriate powers for the regulators. We know, of course, that the regulators had their budgets cut when the coalition first came into office. That makes it tougher for them to stand on the sides of consumers and ensure that you don't get this loyalty tax, where we know that some customers who've been on the books for a while end up paying higher mortgage rates than people who've just come in, basically taking advantage of the fact that we know from behavioural economics people often don't switch to get the best deal because life is busy and switching your mortgage is hard. What
about the government having divestment powers to break up the big banks if they continue to do what they're doing at the moment?
Look, that's not something we're contemplating at the moment. I know the government is waving around their big stick.
So what's your view on his proposal?
Look, federal Labor's view is that that's not something we're considering at the moment. Some countries do have broad divestment powers in their laws. Generally, the way in which they operate is through threat rather than through firms actually being broken up. That happens very rarely.
So how should we treat this proposal or suggestion from Wayne Swan, the ALP president? Is it just merely that?
Wayne frequently raises important issues in the public debate, but as I've told you, Laura, that's not something that federal Labor is contemplating at the moment.
Okay. What would be the concern with that? Because the government is using it on energy companies, or hoping to get that through the parliament this week, in fact. So what would be wrong with doing it with the banks?
On their energy proposal, you've already got people like the head of Origin Energy saying that that's having a chilling effect on investment and that the prospect of their so-called big stick divestment powers is having a damaging impact in the energy sector. So I don't think you'd look at that one and say that that's a ringing endorsement for divestment powers elsewhere in the economy.
The Australian economy is doing pretty well, according to the latest Deloitte report out today. Their words, greatly improving, but domestic problems do persist, and these falling interest rates, as we're seeing today, could actually put more pressure on the housing market. So it's a bit of a be careful what you wish for, isn't it?
Laura, Deloitte's forecasts are lower than the government's, and they forecast that the problems that we've got with wages being stagnant, with unemployment being too high, will continue through to next year. If you go to Britain or Germany or the United States or New Zealand, you'll find countries with unemployment rates around 4%. But ours has been stubbornly over 5%, which means hundreds of thousands more people on the dole queue, and you get that the lack of pressure on wages. So one of the reasons wages aren't growing is that unemployment's too high. The Reserve Bank's doing all it can, but it's like someone trying to swim with one arm. where you've got monetary policy but no fiscal policy action in order to support the economy. They're getting rates now down to historic lows, and the only reason that they're down at that level, Laura, is the lack of fiscal policy action.
Just finally,
the government's not willing to raise Newstart.
Just finally, we are on the other side of an election, and do you think it would be a little bit hard for people to take this morning, a kind of lecture from Labor after just a couple of months ago you were proposing hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes?
Labor, the typical Australian, would have paid lower tax rates had Labor won the last election. But it's incumbent on us to hold the government to account. It's absolutely vital that we talk about the challenges the economy faces and the ambitious optimism that ought to characterise a strong Australian government at this time. This is a moment where the global economy is looking for middle powers to step up to leadership. But when Scott Morrison gives lectures about retreating from globalisation, that takes back Australia's ability to really influence the world economy in our national interest.